Hi everyone! This video is for you if you are new to Zoom or new to teaching on Zoom. I'm going to share with you some of the things I've found to help me create a really fun and engaging online classroom, some of the tips and tricks I've learned about classroom management and time management, and just really encourage you to get into the classroom and play and see all of the different things that Zoom has to offer. It is actually a really wonderful experience. One I think that can be just as wonderful as teaching in a physical classroom. So let's get started. So the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure you have a Zoom account. And once you do that, then you have a couple different options for logging in. You'll need to download Zoom onto your computer. And once you do that, this icon will appear. You can also just go to the Zoom website and sign in and then click host a meeting. I'm going to use the icon. So this will pop up when you click on it, and it allows you to host a meeting in a couple of different ways. You can just launch yourself right into the classroom with a new meeting, and this will allow you to send a link to anyone who you would like to participate, and then they can log on immediately with you. You could also schedule a meeting. So this is oftentimes how we who teach online, this is how this works. We schedule a meeting in advance, and then the participant is sent a link so that they can log in on the time that we've chosen to all gather. So with scheduling a meeting, you just create your class topic, your date, your time. You can decide if it's reoccurring. You go through and click on if you want the host to have their video on immediately upon launching, if you want the participants to have their video on immediately. These settings can be changed once you're in the classroom. You can choose the way that your students can access Zoom, so through the telephone, computer audio, or either. And with the free version, you have to require a meeting password, but know that that password is linked in the URL that you're going to be sending your students, so they won't have to log in with the password as long as they use that link. There's also some advanced options, so you can create a waiting room, you can make it so that your students could join before you can mute people upon entry so you don't get a lot of background noise when everyone enters, and you can also record yourself. And once you're ready, then you just hit schedule, and that link will be created for you so that you can share it with your students. Today, though, we're going to go ahead and just launch into a new meeting, and I'm going to show you all of the different features that Zoom offers, and again, what I have found to be super helpful when I'm teaching online. All right, so we're ready to set up our classroom. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new meeting, and here I am. I'm now in the classroom, and the first thing I do is just get the space set up so that my video and my audio, my lighting, everything is working as best that it can be. You'd be surprised, but lighting is actually pretty important. It can be really hard for your students to see your video if you don't have enough light or you have too much light. You also want to make sure that the background isn't distracting. Of course, you want to make sure you're in a quiet room and that the children in your house or family members in your house know that this is a time that you need to have some quiet and some privacy. I've put signs up on the door before to just help remind my kids that they need to wait until I'm finished, unless it's an emergency, of course. And so once I get everything set up with my video, I make sure I either have headphones or again, I'm just really in a quiet space and everything is working well. I'll go ahead and start setting up the other pieces of my classroom. So one thing that I always use is the chat box. I've found that for students who are resistant to sharing and participating orally, oftentimes the chat box is a really great option for them. I also just think it's a nice way for them to almost like I use it almost like I would my my whiteboard or my chalkboard in my classroom. So I have just a welcome and maybe some kind of bell ringer or a question, a journal entry, something that can just get them started. So I'll go ahead and create that. I also remind them to mute themselves, to mute their audio. It can be really distracting if you have a lot of background noise going on. And so it's just a great habit to get into when you come in. You know, of course, say hello and whatnot, but then just mute your audio. Okay, so I've got a question for them. I'm welcoming them. I'm reminding them to turn their audio off. I have it set that they can chat with everyone. We'll talk about the different settings here in a few minutes. If I wanted to give them a file for them to download or just make sure they have, I can go ahead and do that. So the document that we're going to be working on, I've already sent to my students, but maybe they forgot to download it and to print it out. So I'll make sure that's up there so they can do that so they're ready to go. I'm also going to just click on Manage Participants. This brings up another box. It allows me to see just a list of people who are in my classroom who have already entered, and it also allows me to see if their video is on, if their mic is on, if they have a question and they've raised their hand, which we'll talk about. I can see that. It also helps me if I can mute them all, if there's a lot of background noise, or unmute if I'm wanting some kind of participation. And there's all sorts of other options here that I can go through. So I can mute participants on entry. If I try to encourage my students to use that button themselves, to have some autonomy over it and practice taking turns speaking and whatnot. But certainly you can go ahead and just make it not an option. They just come in quiet. You can decide if if your students can unmute themselves or if their audio is just quiet. You can play a chime so that when someone is entering or exiting the classroom that you know it. With Zoom, you'll see pictures or blocks of all the students who are in your classroom, but depending on how many students are in the classroom at one time, you might not be able to see all of them at one time. So sometimes that chime can be helpful if you are just wanting to pay attention to who's arriving and know that someone has arrived. You can allow participants to rename themselves. So if you're wanting your students to be able to, create nicknames and things for themselves, you can do that. Otherwise, you can turn that option off. So just some settings that I go through to just make sure my classroom's ready. I really recommend getting to your classroom before your students do. It can be really helpful to get everything set up and ready to go. The other thing that I have set up is I have opened up any of the documents that I'm going to be sharing with my students. I'll make sure that if I'm sharing videos or audio clips, anything from the internet, everything is up and ready to go. It's been downloaded or buffered, just so when I'm ready for that tool, it's there and I'm not having to hunt through my files or my computer in order to find it. So I hit share screen, and that document that we're going to be looking at, I pull that up. I always have it up when I begin class. You'll see my picture became smaller, and as my students come in, their pictures will also be this size. I can move them around just to organize my screen. Anything in the green box, my students can see. They can also see the chat box, which I can just pull up again right there. Same with the Manage Participants box. I can pull that up, and again, I can move things around just so they're organized on my screen. If that's a big deal to you, then, which it is to me, it's important just to have everything laid out so I can see everything that's going on. So I always start out my class by going over our class outline, and just helps me to make sure that I am going through all the things that I want to make sure we go through. I think it also gives my students a little bit of a place to land so they know what to expect, especially for my students who might be more anxious about being online or being in a classroom. This just gives them, a little bit of prep so they know what's going to be happening. And so now I've pretty much got everything ready to go for my students, other than one thing. So up here on this black box, we have a number of different things that we can do. One of them is annotate. So this gives us the option to basically turn our screen, anything that we're working in, into a whiteboard. You can create text, draw, format things, save files after you and your students have written all over them or annotated them. One thing to know is that your students also have this option automatically. It's just the default that they can also annotate the screen. And while I think that's a great tool and I absolutely encourage it at certain times, I also think it could be a real distraction. So I always go in and just disable attendee annotation until I'm ready for them to use those tools. Otherwise, curious kids are going to find that tool and they're going to draw all over your desktop and it's going to be super distracting. So let's talk a little bit about classroom agreements and some of the classroom management things that I find, like this disabling the annotation feature, to be really helpful. Okay, so let's talk classroom management. The first thing that I do for my students is I send them classroom agreements. Now I teach online and often have different students each time I teach, so we do not create these agreements together. They're ones that I have come up with and find really work well in an online classroom, and I will share those with you on my blog post. But if you're doing a Zoom class with students that you already have a relationship with, you certainly could come up with classroom agreements together. And these might look very similar to the ones that you might have come up with in your physical classroom, but there are some differences with the online space. So what the classroom agreements do is they just really encourage all of us to make sure that the things we're doing in our online classroom are helping everybody learn and helping everybody to find focus and enjoy themselves and feel safe and heard and all the things that we want to make sure are happening in our classroom. So one of the ways that I do that, like I shared with you, is I make sure that I disable the annotation tool until I am ready for my students to use it. Another thing that I do is in the agreements, I talk about different ways to use our video, our chat box, our sound, how these things, the way that we use these tools really do matter. So for instance, with our video, I never make a student have their video on. It's totally up to them. For some students, the video isn't an option because maybe they're just logging on through the phone or they don't have a video camera on their computer. But in the event that they can choose to have a video, for me, I don't make them have it on. It's up to them. But I do make sure that they're using the video appropriately if they do have it on. So for instance, if we are making faces at each other and causing a lot of disruption in our video, then after a reminder, it's probably best to just encourage or to just turn that video off. So you as the teacher can have your student turn their video off, and you can also turn their video off. So most students are going to just sit in the video and just not do anything that's distracting, but there's a few that like to be silly. I also remind them that if their video is turned on, we can see them, and so that's important. Same with audio. Muting is not a punishment. It's not something that is meant to deter any kind of conversation, but there's a lot of background noise in our homes, and when you have even 1 or 2 students in your classroom, let alone 20 plus, if everyone has their mic on, you're going to hear all sorts of things: dogs barking, parents talking, siblings, babies, One time I even had a student with a parrot who was cawing throughout the class. And so, I always try to make sure that students know that if I mute them or I'm asking them to mute themselves, it's not because I don't want to hear what they have to say. It's just simply so that we can all listen to each other. And like I said earlier, I think it's really great to have the students learn how to mute and unmute themselves as a way of taking turns, as a way of listening. It just allows us to make sure that only one person is talking at a time. And again, that none of the background noises in our homes are distracting us. So you can mute yourself up here. You can also, when you have your managed participants list up, you can mute, you would see a list of students here. You can mute them and they can mute themselves as well. So, and same with turning the video on and off. You can turn the video here for yourself, and then with your students on this list, you could turn it on and off, and then they have the option on their screen as well. So the annotation tool, the video and muting, and then there's one more thing. With the chat box, like I said, it's a great tool, and I absolutely encourage you to use it, but sometimes it can become a real distraction if students start being silly or just chatting with each other on off-topic conversations. So in those classroom agreements and also when we begin class, I just remind them that the chat box is just for us to discuss what we're learning about in our classroom. And in the event that things start to go a different direction and I need to take a little bit of control of the situation, I can come down here, click on that, and the three little dots there, and then I can decide who the chat room conversation is sent to. So maybe if I just want to limit it for everybody, I can say that just the participant can chat with no one. I have everyone selected here. I can have it so that they can just chat with me. So this is also a great option if you are like maybe doing a little assessment or you just want them to share something just with you, so you can have all of those chat comments just come to you. Or again, you can have everyone chatting publicly. And then if I had a list of students here in my classroom, this box would be able to pull down, and then I would be able to select a specific student. So if I had one kiddo who was really having a hard time, then I could just have their chat come to me, or I could just turn their chat off completely. So just some ways to, kindly minimize disruption. So next I'm going to bring my daughter on, and you can kind of see what it looks like when you have a student in your classroom. All right, so now I'm going to show you what it looks like to have a student in your classroom, and also what it looks like to be a student in the classroom. Right now we're just going to be viewing my screen, and my daughter Sophie has joined us. And so you can see that her picture is small, and if I had multiple students, then I would have multiple little pictures all across the screen. You can also see that Sophie's name has come up with participants, and I have the option to mute Sophie, which then puts the little red audio on her picture. I have the option to unmute her. She does as well. So Sophie, can you mute yourself and then unmute yourself? Great. She can also turn her camera on and off. Do you want to do that for us? Great. And she can raise her hand. Will you raise your hand, Soph? Do you remember where that was? It's in the managed participants, kind of down at the bottom. So one of the things that I think is important, great, nice job. So you can see that the picture of the hand showed up on Sophie's picture. It also showed up by her name. You also got a little notification up here. That's really helpful that it shows up in a variety of different places, because if you have a lot of students in your class, you might not be able to see all of their photos at one time. So just being able to see, the hand on the list of students and be able to call on them is really helpful. And it's also really helpful for you to know how to help your students use Zoom, the interface is a little bit different for the students than it is for the teacher. And so in the next video, I'll show you what it looks like on Sophie's screen, so you can just make yourself familiar with the tools they have access to. So
all right, so now I'm going to show you what it looks like to have a student in your classroom and also what it looks like to be a student in the classroom. Right now, we're just going to be viewing my screen, and my daughter Sophie has joined us. And so you can see that her picture is small, and if I had multiple students, then I would have multiple little pictures all across the screen. You can also see that Sophie's name has come up with participants, and I have the option to mute Sophie, which then puts the little red audio on her picture. I have the option to unmute her. She does as well. So Sophie, can you mute yourself and then unmute yourself?
Hello.
Great. She can also turn her camera on and off. You want to do that for us? Great. And she can raise her hand. Can you raise your hand, Soph?
It didn't come up again. It's weird.
Do you remember where that was? In the manage participants?
Oh.
It's kind of down at the bottom.
Oh, here, I got it.
So one of the things that I think is important, great, nice job. So you can see that the picture of the hand showed up on Sophie's picture. It also showed up by her name. You also got a little notification up here. That's really helpful that it shows up in a variety of different places, because if you have a lot of students in your class, you might not be able to see all of their photos at one time. So just being able to see, the hand on the list of students and be able to call on them is really helpful. It's also really helpful for you to know how to help your students use Zoom. The interface is a little bit different for the students than it is for the teacher. And so in the next video, I'll show you what it looks like on Sophie's screen, so you can just make yourself familiar with the tools they have access to. So their tools are fairly simple in that they have access to the chat box. They can just send a message to the teacher or to everybody. And then, like I said before, you can also decide who your students are sending messages to. So we just see hi from Sophie. She just sent us a message, and she sent it to everyone. Sophie, can you see if you can figure out how to send one to me privately? And then I can also, if I have multiple students in the space, I can mute them all, unmute them all. Again, I have all these settings here that kind of help to set the tone in my classroom and how things are going. Did you find the private one?
No, what should it look like?
okay, so I just want to leave you with some final thoughts and some things that I've noticed as I've put this video together. One of the things I noticed was that even though my daughter and I went over how to use all the tools together, it was still hard for her to remember and to find all the different things that I was asking her to find. And this is just what it is. It's going to take time, it's going to take practice, and we're going to have to be patient. It can be really helpful if possible, and I know it's not always possible, but if possible, for a student to have someone else on the other side of the camera with them to help them find their tools. It can also be really helpful to do some practice sessions. Once they get the hang of it, they will. They'll totally be able to run circles around all of us and how to use this forum, but it is going to take some practice, and it can be super frustrating in the beginning when they can't find what they're looking for. Another thing I noticed in the video with my daughter is that she was talking to me and I could not hear her because she was muted. And I didn't realize that she was talking to me until I saw the video that was capturing her screen. That's the downside of the mute button. Sometimes we forget to unmute ourselves and we start talking, and it turns out that no one can hear us. So something, again, to practice, that paying attention to the mute button and making sure that we use that to mute and unmute ourselves at the right times. Another thing that has been important for me to remember as an online teacher is to always make sure all of my notifications on my computer have stopped and I've quit them. So I make sure I've quit my email, text messaging, anything that might flash across my screen, because if it does, it's possible my students will see it. And I just want to encourage you to start small, to have your class lesson plans start simple. You don't have to recreate the exact experience that your students are used to. You can just simply gather together and read a story, or you can do some math problems together, or watch some videos online together and then talk about them. You don't have to do really complicated projects with them right off the bat. Simple is better when you're beginning, and then as you and your students begin to get more comfortable with this way of learning and teaching, then you can get more complicated. Have fun. I'm happy to answer any questions. If any come up, you're going to do great. Good luck.